Welcome to the CAFMA Connect. I'm your host, Fire Chief Scott Freitag, and back with me again this week, Assistant Chief John Feddema.
It's an honor to be back.
Yeah, whatever.
Oh, no, I just love it. And I need to point out, too, I think you had a few guests in here that are liars when they wanted to promote how much they just really appreciated being here. I think there were some lies being told.
Well, I think it's because, like with Copenhagen and the Pipes and Drums Band, I gave them the opportunity to sell themselves and seek donations.
Yeah,
so, which is not illegal, against statute, unethical, or immoral for a 501c3.
Perfect.
Who's been subjected to COVID shutdowns.
That's true.
So a couple things to hit on first. One, I would be remiss if we didn't point out our new flag.
Yes.
Captain and artist Damian Liss made that. I have no idea how he did that, but that is beautiful.
No, it looks good. 3D, and yeah, I like it.
He apparently had borrowed the other one from someone else and told him he'd have it back to him in a few days, and a couple months later.
That's all right. It was a nice backdrop.
It was.
This is good, too.
Then we went with another backdrop that apparently you could see Jonah walking in the background at a clock. I was unaware of that, but
it just helps show that there's a whole team that is necessary to help with the podcast to get it out there.
Now, let's touch on another topic real quick that involves Assistant Chief Dave Tharp, because we should congratulate him, I think, since he was voted today by us to be nominated for the Area 7 representative role for Arizona Fire District Association.
Congratulations, Dave.
Yeah, it was a 3-1 vote in a democracy. Yes. We acknowledged the one. This was more of a railroad, so we consider it unanimous.
Yep.
Yeah, 3 votes, you win.
I like it.
I like it too. It's good, and we're doing that because we want to communicate.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And communicating, John, is hard.
Yes, it is. That's a life lesson that I've continued to work on, and I don't think it's any surprise for anybody that's watched a previous podcast that it comes up quite often, my communication skills or the lack thereof. And I'd probably be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that I'm probably one of the few people whose mother had to like coach on how to have a conversation. Right. And the nice thing is she used, baseball as an analogy to help me understand what it means to have a conversation. And, she said, when you have a conversation, you're meeting with somebody. It's like playing catch with a baseball.
Right.
That makes sense to me. She said, when somebody comes up to you and asks you, how are you doing? They're throwing the baseball to you. You catch it by saying, I'm doing well. And you throw it back by asking them a question. How are you today? And then pretty soon you're playing catch, having the conversation.
Right.
I was very good at catching the ball or just letting the ball go right on by and running off with it.
Oh, perfect.
Yes, that was my experience with communication younger. Obviously, to be successful in life and this job, it's been delivered. And I think I've provided in the past how I've tried to work on that in terms of going to the schools, teaching, doing that stuff to get better at it. But it is a constant learning.
Well, and I think you would one would believe, if they listen to me at all, with all of the words that I use, that I would be communicating enough, more than enough, and that the message would be clear. And unfortunately, no one's perfect, and so we miss the mark sometimes when we communicate. And it's interesting because we're not just talking about talking, right?
Sure.
We're not just talking about the person conveying the message, one person to another, the person who threw the ball, the person who catches the ball. Using your mom's analogy, if they don't understand the message that's been conveyed, then as part of communication, they have a responsibility to look back at the other person and say, this is what I heard you say. Am I understanding that correctly? And that's an area of communication people fall down on. We know that we're not always going to communicate clearly.
Sure.
But on the other side, we have to be willing to say, I'm not sure I understood the message.
Yeah, it's there's definitely times when, in a conversation, whatever it is, whether it's, a meeting, whether it's, just you and I discussing whatever it is, even an evaluation. I had 2 end of probation interviews today, and obviously there's a lot of discussion, a lot of questions that are asked.
Right.
And in the process of it, obviously, you would hope that if someone's not understanding the message, no different. We look at the fire ground. If you don't understand the order that's been given to you, you need to clarify that. And obviously, I think that happens in communication as well. Just trying to get the clarification that say, okay, here's what I heard you say. Is that what you're trying to relay to me? And at the same time, obviously, as a communicator at that point, being willing to say, okay, wait, no. Maybe that didn't come out right.
Right.
Somehow I said that wrong or didn't use enough words or I used too many, And, the right communication for the right circumstance, that's where the skill comes in.
Well, and understanding your audience as well. And there's times where you're trying to piece together, what happened?
Yeah.
How did this get to here?
Oh, yeah.
And you start backtracking, and you're like, oh, that was a statement back here that was made that this person interpreted this way because this person spoke in as definitive or absolute. Yeah. This is this. And so this person feels slighted, and then they come back to a meeting with this, and then now everybody's focused on that thing, when in reality, if that person would have just asked a clarifying question, either at that time or at the beginning of another meeting, we could avoid additional misunderstanding.
Sure. Countries have gone to war because of misunderstanding, lack of communication, or a lost in translation in that moment. So, we can always get better, but with any conversation, there's 2 sides to that.
Sure.
And like I say, I think there's opportunity to make sure you're whatever, especially in those high stress environments or a meeting where you're trying to get something very clearly conveyed, making sure that, okay, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me today and clarify it.
Well, and I think, I had a conversation with somebody recently about a situation that was this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But by the time this happened, none of this was really in play or part of the conversation. But when we started to break it down, you look back at it and say, okay, in this situation to begin with, I could have done better at communicating this in this way. Whatever that message is, I could have done better communicating this in this way. So that's step 1 that went wrong.
Sure.
Step 2 that went wrong was you didn't ask for any clarification, so I assumed you understood what my intent was. And then, bam, you come in here, headed this direction, and I'm left going, what the heck are you doing? And by the time we get around to it and we get to the crux of the issue, and this is part of that Oz principle, right? Everybody owns a part of it.
Yeah.
My response to that is, you know what? I should have recognized that what I was saying sounded more definitive or absolute when I said it. That was not my intent. Had you asked me the question at that time, I could have clarified for you what that was. But instead, now we're this far down the road and all of these other things that we're trying to clean up. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We'll go back to the baseball. My boys have had the opportunity to start baseball again, and it's awesome to watch them play. And I learn a lot more from baseball and the lessons, I think, than they do in terms of the rest of the story. But it was funny because just the other night, we had a baseball game, and a little boy gets on first base. I'm helping coach first base, and he gets there, and I was trying to help him understand, like, okay, when the ball crosses the plate, you need to get off the base and be ready to go to second base. Like, okay, sounds good. Like, all right, so the ball crosses the plate, never moved. Okay, come on back, bud, look at me. Like, did you understand what I said last time? Yes. Like, okay, so when the ball goes, if the catcher misses the ball, this time I want you running to second base. Okay, sounds good. Ball goes right by the catcher. Doesn't move. Like, all right. It was a lesson in patience to turn around. Somehow what I'm saying is not coming across right. So I turn around, and this is all going on during the live game.
Sure.
Nice thing, it's a Little League baseball game.
Right.
Everybody's having fun. Turns around and says, okay, but I somehow I'm off on this. Do you understand that you can get to that base? Oh, really? Like, yes. When the ball goes beyond, do you think you have enough speed to get to that base? No, I don't think I do. I'm going to tell you, you do.
Right.
You have that. You have the opportunity. You can get there. Trust me on this. You can get there. Okay. Let's try this again. When he throws it, if it goes by the catcher again, you run. Sounds good. Goes by the catcher. Still nothing. Turn around one last time, like, okay, man, I am really struggling with, I know I'm bad at this, but we're not getting this. He said, okay, you just tell me when to go. Like, okay, that sounds good. I'll do that. Next pitch, go. Turns around. Now? Yes, now.
Right now.
It was, I had to laugh at the end of it. I mean, I was like one of those things, I'm trying to pull my hair out, but it was just a great example of, for me, like, man, I can be as clear as I think I can be. That message was not sinking in.
Yeah.
And part of it was a confidence. And I think that goes with any conversation. We go into conversations with insecurities. Sure. Our own kind of mindset of how the conversation is going to go. This is going to go good. It's going to go bad. And sometimes the best thing we do is scrap all that. Right. And just try to do our best to clearly articulate the message and read the person we're talking to, whether you're on the receiving end or the speaking end of it.
Right. No, absolutely. And the other part of this is, again, I want to go back, try not to speak in definitives or absolutes unless it is absolutely definitive or absolute. Yeah. Otherwise, leave some room in the conversation for additional dialogue. You're going to get to a point where it's yes or no. Yeah. But you need to know when that is. It's about timing. And I know over the last few months, personally, I've been through a few incidents where I'm like, man, I could have done better. I talk about communication. I tell people we don't do a great job of it, but we're really trying. And then I just totally blow it. And we have to take a step back at that point, understand who we're talking to. The other thing that you have to do when you're communicating with someone or you're receiving information is, what filter are you listening to the message through? Is it a filter of emotion? Is it a filter of, I already disagree with the direction? What filter are you using? Because if you, as the receiver, are listening from a standpoint of emotion, then that message isn't going to get through. And it doesn't matter how clear the message is, it's not going to get through. And then if the receiver is slightly off in providing the message and you have an emotional filter, now the message is just a complete cluster. Yeah. You're not getting anywhere.
No, and I have obviously almost a year into the job at this point. And like you say, I've had numerous examples of like, man, I really could have done that better. I've had examples, where I could tell my blood pressure was going up. And it's like, I need to change something so I'm not getting to this moment where I can tell I'm frustrated. Right. And, enter the conversation with a different mindset at that point. And I've also, and I think you've highlighted before in the podcast, but I can real easily focus on the meat of the conversation. Right. I'm short and concise, if nothing else. Right. Problem is, there's a whole lot of other communication that needs to happen in some of the situations. Yes. And obviously, there are folks on the other end that can talk all the way around the meat of the conversation and never hit it, and you go nowhere also. Finding a healthy balance. That's been the challenge. And I've had moments of success and I've had moments of failure. And part of it is there's it's easy to focus on that core for me, but at the same time, you've mentioned it before, sometimes people need to hear the rest of it. Sometimes they need to hear the decision-making process, the thoughts that go along with it. Mm-hmm. I even look at our, the wage study and all that stuff that came out. Sometimes in communication, we can't even communicate fast enough to get all the information out there. We do our best to provide information. Like I say, there's the review, there's lots of different opportunities, but I've seen messages get out faster than I can even track down at that point. Oh, yeah. And so it's trying to find that balance and understanding sometimes like, well, let me give you the rest of the story at this point because there's more to it.
Well, and we need to remember, and I think Jonah can probably back me up on this, if we send an email correspondence out that we want people to read, for whatever reason, they hit delete. But if they get some phishing email that they're not supposed to click on, they'll click on that button all day long. Yeah. Start clicking on the right things and then read it. Yeah. And don't click on the wrong things because it messes up the system. We don't want to be like Kingman. No offense to Kingman.
Yeah, maybe a little.
Maybe a little offense. I mean, it is Jake Rhodes. What do we do? The other part of this is if you're going to send out a draft of something that is likely to get out somewhere, or your intention is that it goes out, use the draft watermark. Be very clear about what this is so that people understand, because when you just send out a document and it comes from someone in senior staff, it appears to others to be pretty definitive.
Sure.
This is what we're doing. And most times it's not our intent.
Yeah.
And that happens more often than I'd like to think it does.
Sure.
Like I said, I thought I was pretty good at communicating. I have a degree in communications, and yet here I am falling short. But the other part of it is, as the person receiving the message, understand and try to not to get into a position of you're not listening to me mindset.
Yeah.
Because the fact that we disagree doesn't mean I'm not listening to you.
Sure.
It means that we have a different opinion. Now, there are times when people aren't listening. Absolutely. I'm going to use the state legislature as an example because they're a really good example of not listening to people. But I'm in committee, and you have people that have a mindset, whatever that is, whatever view that is. And it doesn't matter what you're saying on the topic. They are absolutely going to ignore you. And then they will pontificate on whatever their opinion is. And you're looking at them going, what?
Yeah.
That doesn't even make sense. It's not even in context with what we're discussing.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think at least in CAFMA, we do try hard. We don't always get there, but we try hard to listen. Yeah. And some of it is, and I'm just going to throw this out there for people, we think of people in a certain way. People come across or perceived in some way. Yeah. And so someone might come to me and I'll look at them and be like, oh, not again. Mm-hmm. And I immediately shut down.
Sure.
And I think that's anything. It's in personal life, it's at work, it's professional, whatever it is. Again, it goes back to that filter. Mm. What filter you, and if you know, man, I have a tendency to glass over.
Yeah.
Then you need to consciously think about, I need to listen, because even if it's someone you disagree with a lot of the time, the fact of the matter is, if you listen, sometimes they have a really good point.
Sure.
And you miss some good ideas if you just write somebody off.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, something that I've tried to, learn from as well is not, like say, in the listening part of it, but leaving the door open, because sometimes you can be too indecisive, but not trying to respond immediately. Because sometimes, I have an opinion, something, that the conversation is going down a certain road, like, man, I have an opinion on this. I already have a thought on this. But sometimes, I've learned that there's a benefit just kind of absorbing it and not necessarily that initial, like, well, here's my thought back in return.
Right.
You said this, I'm going to throw the baseball back at you. And there's an advantage of not just throwing it back 80 miles an hour back in their face, that, absorbing it for a little bit and understand and talking around some of it before you get back to, like, hey, now here's some of my opinion as well.
Sure.
And obviously it's conversation. And I'm not always good at it, but that's like I say, the learning part of it. The other, I was going to go back to the baseball one, because there are people in life that they walk around with a bucket of baseballs.
Right.
I was always good at taking the ball and running with it, but there are people that can just continue to pelt you with them.
Oh, yes.
And there's been a few examples in CAFMA's history, Central's history, that I had to laugh that it doesn't matter how many I pocketed and ran away with. They could keep on throwing it.
And they throw them at the back of your head.
My nemesis, yes.
Yes. Those things absolutely happen. Today I don't want to call it an opportunity, but I guess that would be the best way to characterize it so it doesn't sound negative, right? So one of the topics in a discussion I was in today was climate change, which always just...
Nice.
I have an opinion on that, an opinion on a lot of things, but... And it's not an opinion that is... Is
it an expert opinion?
Absolutely, it's an expert opinion.
You're paid.
Yeah, I'm paid.
Yes.
I'm paid. My card says expert. Remember, we got rid of fire chief.
Yeah, perfect.
But so I went into this with the filter of, I don't want to hear any more of this rhetoric about how we need to do this or we need to do that with electric cars. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning. I read the title. Well, it cost me money to read the rest of it.
That's true.
But it said there are more emissions expended in producing an electric car than there are from other fossil fuel fired vehicles. Now it said, so where do they make up the difference, right? But we know long term, when that battery goes out, they have to bury it somewhere.
Yeah.
And they had to dig it up. And the car's being charged by fossil fuels.
Yes.
That's where electricity comes from, typically. So there's those things. And so I had that filter. I'm like, you have to listen. So the person who was talking about climate change and wasn't discussing at all anything about alternative energy sources. He was simply going through data that shows, here's a picture from 1941, here's one from 2014, here's the graphs and charts. And I'm like, wow, this is actually kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then at one point he said wildfire. Now, being from St. Louis, you and I both know that is not my area of expertise. But having been in Arizona for 7.5, almost 8 years now, I have a little bit, very little bit of knowledge about it. And so he said climate change has created more intense wildfires. And so I went into wherever I was on a chat thing and I said, well, if the forests have not been managed properly for years, which has created a lot more fuel, if we're looking at climate change from a drought perspective that we're in, the drought is a contributing factor, but the fact that we have so many fuels is really the driving force. And then if we look beyond that, 82% of wildfires are human caused, which means a lot of this is our fault. We didn't manage things properly with the forests, and we're starting the fire. Stop doing that, right?
Yes.
So
don't do that. Just don't do that.
Right, don't do that. So a facilitator said, hey, Professor Guy, here's something from Scott Freitag. And he stopped, and I unmuted and said what I wanted to say. And he said, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you brought that up because you are absolutely right. And Jen was around, my wife, when he said that.
Did you record that?
Yeah, I'm
meeting?
like, hey, you heard that, right?
Yeah.
I need you to mark that on the calendar.
Yep.
It's my one for the day. But ultimately, he said, no, I absolutely agree with you.
Sure.
And when we look at most of these things, it's because we've poorly managed the way that we've approached. He said, when you build in a floodplain, you should expect that you're going to get flooded out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of it.
Well, and that's where you have to look at all, the statistics, the data, all that stuff, and you got to really be careful how you correlate that and what you tie it to. Because, like I said, you could easily try to say, that climate change is responsible for all these fires, but there are a ton of contributing factors that go along with this that you need to look at as well.
Right.
And go back to COVID and all other things. You can't make a one-dimensional decision, or we're going to be left with what we were left with.
Right.
And like you say, they've certainly in the last few years tried to push much harder to managing the forest, creating breaks, creating defensible spaces. There's a lot of work to be done, but yeah, like you say, we look at the number of fires that are started of human caused, just down highways and everything that we're constantly fighting, and then without the regular fires and the mitigation, they're going to be bigger no matter what.
Yeah, they are. More people are moving into the urban interface, and they're moving out of the urban or suburban areas, and they're like, I like to be able to touch the tree out the window. Yeah. Well, if you do that, your house is going to burn down. Yeah. If there's a wildland fire. But in this situation, I had to consciously remove the filter enough to at least hear what the gentleman had to say. Yep. And what I found was when I listened to this person speak about climate change, I'm like, we are not necessarily in disagreement in what you're talking about here. Sure. And I was surprised by that. But I think that's an example, though, that if you can remove some of those filters and listen to the other person, we can communicate far more clearly and be more productive. Yeah,
I agree. And you look at even some of the meetings, and some of the examples that, I think we've talked about outside of this. Some of it is, like you say, just being gracious enough to listen at that point, right? And realize that in all that we're doing, and certainly in the senior staff, moving forward, it's not to hurt anybody. It's not the intent is not to hold anybody down. The goal is to do good things. The goal is to move this organization forward with the support of all the personnel, coming alongside. We want to do good things. That's
Yes.
the ultimate intent.
Absolutely.
We're going to disagree on what good things look like sometimes, but I think people need to understand that that is the basis of
Right.
who we are at this point.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's lost when we disagree.
Well, and I think people need to understand as well that there are times that we have the information and data we need, and it's a topic that we just need to decide on as senior staff.
Yeah.
And just because we have to decide on it and we're not getting a lot of outside input because we have all the facts already, doesn't mean that if somebody has a question that they don't deserve an explanation. It's not going to change where we're headed, but we'll certainly sit down and explain the situation to you, which I think is an open way to try to communicate with folks. Yep. Now, the only time, well, we won't go into the definitive that has to do with masks because that might upset someone. So I'm just going to leave it alone.
Perfect.
But I think moving forward, yeah, I've learned some lessons over the last several weeks and couple of months about, man, I really need to work on this. And I'm working with a communications coach, so I'm going to relay this to him and say, here's what I've seen recently. Can you help me? And then help me so I can help others understand. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for the senior staff anyways is don't speak definitively or absolutely unless that is the message that needs to be conveyed. Yep. Otherwise, understand your audience, understand the topic that we're dealing with, understand how many meetings are left to discuss those topics, and then craft a message or relay a message that leaves an opening. And then for those out in the audience or wherever you are in the room communicating, if you're not clear or it seemed like it came across as a definitive and it shouldn't have been, then ask for clarification. Don't let it fester and just sit and frustrate people. That we don't want to do that. And at the same time, we're always open, I think, as senior staff to say, oh, I didn't know that had occurred or that's how you feel. Let's sit down, get your staff, and let's have a conversation. And we're just going to open the floor. We're going to listen to what you have to say. We're going to take that, and then if it's appropriate to respond, we will.
Sure. And like you said, I think going back a little bit what you said at the very beginning right there, the willingness to continue to get better. Right. And I think that's in all aspects, hopefully for everybody in the fire service, is continue to work to get better. And I think, no different than communication, all the other skills necessary to do the job at all levels. Certainly this last year for me, this has been a learning lesson that I'm guaranteed it's certainly not over with. But I think everybody needs to kind of reflect and be willing to have the humility to say, no, I still got things to work on. No matter where you're at in your career, no matter what level, what whether the fire chief or the firefighter, what can I do to keep getting better and being more effective at my job at all levels?
The interesting part of this, we talk about this here at a professional level, and then when I get home, Jen's like, you could practice that.
Do a little work here. Yes.
Here, you could do a little bit better in communicating here, tone, body language, things like that. So the message is professional, but it's also think about it when you're talking to your loved ones or your kids. Think about how you're communicating, because really, if we practice that in all aspects of our lives, we will get better over time. So, John, I as always, I appreciate it. I know this is we've talked about communication a lot on the podcast. I think this one warranted a little more, a broader scope, so to speak. But for the rest of this week and next week and beyond there, if you're communicating with someone, remember playing catch. Right, you're providing input. Somebody's giving you some feedback. And there's a loop there of communication. If that loop breaks down, you're not going to communicate clearly.
And don't throw it at their head.
Yeah, don't throw it at their head. Don't speak in definitives or absolutes unless that's what it is. And make sure you put a watermark draft if it's a draft document that's going out to folks. So thank you for tuning in. Next week, we're going to try to get the new director of PRCC, our Communications Center, on. We're going to call him shortly.
Awesome.
And that will trap him in a room with Jonah, our tech services manager, and myself.
Be great.
And we can help him find focus and clarity.
I like it.
That's good.